Hi, welcome to the lecture on the Age of Reason. In this lecture, we'll take a look at the intellectual and technological developments that took place in the European world from approximately the 1500s through the 1700s and a little bit beyond. The bulk of the lecture is going to focus on a lot of innovations that had to do with new ideas concerning astronomy and, to a limited extent, also scientific or science, as well as kind of what we call the dawning of the modern mentality or the modern worldview, in that we're having a shift away from kind of a focus upon religion and moving towards a focus upon logic and reasoning. And that focus, that shift of focus, will continue to intensify and strengthen itself as we approach the 17 and 1800s, which is a period that we call the Age of the Enlightenment, which is the attempt to kind of make logic and reasoning more important than religion, emotion, or sentiment. So, if we take a look at the scientific revolution, one of the first things we're going to see, of course, is we're going to see that shift in terms of a focus upon the natural world and the use of new technologies. While we did have some technological innovation and intellectual innovation taking place in the period that we call the Middle Ages, it's really starting in the 1350s and 1400s and then building through the 1500s that we see this shift to what we call a reasonable age. If we take a look at some of the ideas or some of the names here on the outline, Sir Francis Bacon is kind of a lesser known figure, but it's his kind of ideas and writing that kind of ushered in this switch. He was a very vocal proponent of using what we call the scientific method, as opposed to using a more kind of philosophical or kind of traditional view of a religiously inspired worldview. Rene Descartes, another one of these thinkers, is probably most well known for his contributions to math and his argument about existence. We have the famous syllogism, "I think, therefore I am." The first part of that, of course, is that all things that think exist or are. And he says, "I think, therefore I must exist." Now, that may seem pretty basic, but it is a fairly new idea in the sense that Rene Descartes is the first person to kind of justify the existence of humanity without referencing either a higher power or a spiritual being or a spiritual entity to explain the cause of existence for mankind. Last but not least, kind of taking it to the extreme, we have the Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who argued that a reduction of the spiritual world to argue that, in fact, God, the spiritual entity, is not spiritual or supernatural, but rather can be explained through natural sciences and a view of the natural world. That's kind of the end of the spectrum that would eventually kind of lead some thinkers to, is the belief that one could define the supernatural world with a purely kind of rational understanding of scientific law. If we move forward, we take a look at the main kind of ideas or changes that were taking place in astronomy. And this is really when, in the 1500s and 1600s, we're going to see pretty much the creation of our modern kind of understanding to a basic extent. We're going to see the creation of our modern understanding of the universe. First and foremost, we start with a Polish astronomer by the name of Nikolai Copernicus. And it's going to be Copernicus's theory that we call the heliocentric theory that is kind of, it's going to define the universe in a new way. And very simply put, the heliocentric theory is a belief that the sun, Greek word helios, is at the center of the universe, as opposed to what we call the geocentric theory, which was a belief that the earth was the center of the universe. In support of that idea, we're going to have the ideas and the invention of the telescope by Galileo Galilei, who is going to basically support Copernicus and Copernican theories of the universe with the data and the technology to kind of prove the theory to a limited extent. Now, as you might expect, this pretty groundbreaking theory about the Earth not being the center of the universe had its continuing support. On the scientific side, we have the support of a very famous astronomer by the name of Tycho Brahe. But more importantly than that, we had a religious and a cultural emphasis that the heliocentric theory should not be adopted. Not because of its science necessarily, even though it did have some flaws and some of its predictions about how the universe worked, but rather it was more rejected, especially by religious leaders in the form of the Catholic Church. It was rejected because it had introduced an idea that affected the Catholic or the religious view that humanity was the center of the universe. The idea behind the whole geocentric theory was that the Earth was the center of the universe because humanity reside upon it. And so basically these new ideas, although they were scientifically new and could possibly be challenged scientifically, a larger kind of question or negative response came from medieval European society. That was, these new ideas were forcing people to kind of question their own identity, their place in the universe, and from a religious perspective, their place in terms of the story of creation. So this debate between the geocentric theory and the heliocentric theory, it raged for several decades. And eventually it would be universally accepted, not because of the ideas of Copernicus and Galileo, but rather because of the arguments made by a later astronomer by the name of Johannes Kepler. Now, what's interesting is that Kepler was, in fact, a student of Tycho Brahe, who was probably the leading anti-heliocentric theory scientist. However, what really caused a change was Kepler's his new take on Brahe's data. Brahe had spent his entire life basically recording the movement of the stars. And when Brahe died, all of those notes and all of that data was left to his greatest student, his greatest mentee, Johannes Kepler. And now Kepler took that, he crunched the numbers, and what he fundamentally did, which kind of cemented the heliocentric theory, was that Kepler created a new view of the universe, not just by substituting the sun in place of the Earth at the center of the universe, but rather by completely redefining the whole idea of how the universe was ordered. And he did this, as the outline kind of stipulates, in the proposition or the idea that planets orbited the sun, not in perfect circles, which is what both Brahe and Copernicus and Galileo thought, but rather that it orbits the sun in an elliptical orbit, kind of like an egg-shaped orbit. And once Kepler plugged that idea in to go with the heliocentric theory, it actually removed all of the scientific objections to the heliocentric theory, and it kind of locked it in and made it uniform and eventually universal. Now, the one problem that Kepler had was he couldn't explain why the universe was based on elliptical orbits. He got the idea based on the data that planets basically widened their orbit path at the backside of the orbit, and then it narrowed it on the top side, kind of like an egg. But what he didn't know was why. And the big thing behind the why came in the form of arguably one of the greatest mathematicians and astronomers of the time, a guy by the name of Sir Isaac Newton. And Newton, the reason why most people know Newton's name is that Newton kind of put the why behind it. And the why, of course, is Newton's theory of gravity. Very simply put, gravity is the idea that there is a force generated by mass, that all things that have a mass to them, that are composed of matter, all things generate a force of attraction. And the idea was that the larger the object, the greater the force. And with that idea in place, Newton could explain why something as large as a planet is in fact forced to move on its orbital path. And the reason behind that, of course, is the force of gravity generated between the object and the sun. And so this theory of gravity put in place a mechanism to explain how the universe worked and how the universe constantly worked. Because if this is a consistent force generated by mass, then it would be a consistent, quote, law of the universe that would basically force planets to orbit other larger planets or stars. It explained why moons move in the orbit around a planet. And it basically provided a scientific explanation rather than a religious one, or rather than one based on supernatural ideology. It provided a scientific explanation for how the universe not only moves, but how it continues to move. And that's why, more than anyone, Newton was going to be responsible for this kind of shift to a rational, reasonable worldview. Next on the outline, we have a couple of political / social theorists that helped to kind of redefine the way that people thought not only about themselves, but also thought about the type or the structures of government. Now, the first person we're going to talk about is Sir Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes represents kind of a summary of the old way of thinking about government. If you'll notice on point number 1, Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan. And Leviathan is kind of an explanation for why monarchy and absolute monarchy, that topic that we went through last time, absolute monarchy is kind of the way that people thought government should work. And the idea behind government was that it was basically a contract, that at the beginning of civilization, people decided to give up their, quote, total freedom. They gave up the ability to do whatever they wanted in exchange for a government that would impose order and protection. And so that was the idea. The traditional idea of government was that it was a contract made at the beginning of civilization, that people gave up freedom in exchange for protection and order. And that was the idea that kind of was based on everything. But it's important to note the big distinction here is that it was an agreement made, it was a contract made at the beginning of human civilization. And the idea behind it was, as point number 3 mentions, the idea behind it was that you had to have an external control because human nature was prone to selfishness and that human beings were prone to take advantage of each other. Now, the new way of thinking, the new thinker that comes around and creates a new idea of government is somebody we've already talked about. And that guy is, of course, John Locke. If you remember when we talked about constitutionalism, John Locke is the political theorist that came up with the whole kind of intellectual foundation that constitutionalism, modern constitutionalism, is based on. And the big difference here is fundamentally 2 things. John Locke argued against Thomas Hobbes that people were basically selfish. He, in fact, argued for one of the first times in Western culture, he argued that people were basically good. And that if you gave people freedom, they would more than likely basically use it to do good things. And that's a fundamentally basic idea that was different than Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes said if you give people power, they will abuse it. John Locke said if you give people power, most people will use it properly. And that all came down to kind of a basic theory that John Locke had, which was what we call the tabula rasa theory. And the tabula rasa theory was that John Locke believed that at birth, people were basically born kind of neutral or tending towards positive nature, and that as time went on, if they were exposed to good parenting and good societal norms and rules, they would become positive, normal, and good people. And so that was kind of the idea behind Locke's thinking. And then by extension, Locke believed that government was in fact a contract between the people ruled and the government, but that it was a constant contract in which the government had to constantly fulfill its end of the bargain, which was, according to John Locke, the protection of the rights of life, liberty, and property. Hobbes believed that the contract applied between the government and the people, and the government had to safeguard not all individual rights, but had to safeguard the protection of the majority of people. Not everyone, but a majority. And he believed that if a government made half of the people, more than half of the people satisfied, then a government would retain power. Locke, on the other hand, argued that a government had an individual responsibility to each citizen, that individual right of life, liberty, and property had to be safeguarded for all citizens. And that was a fundamental change. And that then produced a fundamentally new view of government, one that supported an increase of personal liberty, as we said before in the constitutional lecture, a balance between government authority to protect and provide order and individual liberty to provide, in fact, a stable world. Now, the interesting thing is if we look to the next lecture, the quote Enlightenment, which is going to basically make the argument that reason and logic should be absolute, the fundamental keys to the origins of that Enlightenment movement are going to be John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton. And the interesting thing is these two thinkers, more than just for their thoughts about government or their thoughts about the universe, in the case of Newton, what they did in terms of impacting people's understanding of both themselves and of God and of human nature and the universe. Their ideas, even though they didn't talk about this or they didn't make these connections, later intellectual thinkers argued, based upon Locke and Newton, that we needed to completely revamp our complete understanding not only of the natural world, but also of the supernatural world and its implications for humanity. And so that's kind of what's going to take place in the Age of Enlightenment, is we're going to go beyond science and reasoning, and we're going to seek to make everything rational, including things like love or beauty or what we might call emotional or subjective factors. They're going to seek to make those rational as well, and they're going to extend that kind of rationality to a belief of a new world order, a new universal order, in which it's not God that makes evil or makes people do good things, but rather it's what we call the old argument of nature versus nurture. That it's not human nature that makes people bad, it's the nurturing or it's the society around them that produces bad behavior. And so naturally, if you remove God as the source of good action, and you more than likely remove the devil as the source of negative action and make it rather an environmental nurturing type equation, then you no longer have a need for either God or the devil. And conversely, scientifically, if gravity makes the universe work, then the question arises, what is the purpose of God's action in the universe if he is not needed, if that entity is not needed to make the planet's orbit around the sun, etc.? What is the role of God in a perfectly rational, logical universe? And that's going to be the question that's taken up under or within the context that we call the Enlightenment movement. I hope this lecture's been helpful. And again, if you guys have any questions, please email me. And I look forward to talking with you again at our next lecture. Thank you.